We always think of history as what's written down, right? The big events, the loud declarations. But what if the most important parts are the ones that are never spoken? Well, that's the core idea behind a really provocative book called A Silent History by Kanji Nishio. And trust me, it's a book that challenges the entire post-war narrative by asking us to listen to the silence. So, right off the bat, Nishio hits us with this powerful idea. He says, history has parts that are silent. While silent, they are in fact speaking. For him, a nation's silence, it isn't just empty space. It's not an admission of anything. No, it's actually a form of communication, a story being told by what's not being said. It's a pretty heavy idea, for sure, but you gotta grasp this to understand where he's going with everything else. And this really frames the whole debate, doesn't it? What if a nation's silence isn't an admission of guilt, but a form of protest? I mean, think about it. Nishio's argument is that for decades, the world has been looking for this one simple "I'm sorry" from Japan. But his work is basically asking, hey, what if the real story of the war is just way too complicated, way too messy to ever fit neatly into a single apology? Okay, so let's dig into this idea of a silent history. What does he actually mean by that? Well, it's not about ignoring what happened or pretending the past didn't exist, not at all. For Nishio, it's something active. It's a conscious, deliberate refusal to just go along with a story that was written for them by someone else. And this is where he really flips the whole script. You know the common criticism, right? That Japan can't seem to get its story straight, can't form a single official apology. Well, Nishio looks at that and says that's not a failure, that is the point. He argues that this lack of a single, neat apology is itself a silent protest. It's a political statement against what he sees as a simplistic, one-sided narrative that was written by the victors of the war. So this idea of a silent protest leads him right into a pretty sharp critique of Japan's post-war diplomacy. In his view, Japan has been caught in something he calls the apology trap. It's this endless cycle that he believes doesn't really serve Japan, but instead serves the political goals of other countries. Yeah, he actually coins a term for it, apology diplomacy. And what he means by that is, from his perspective, these repeated apologies aren't really about genuine remorse anymore. They've become a political tool, something used against Japan to keep it in a subordinate position. He argues that every time Japan apologizes, it just resets the clock. And pretty soon there's a demand for another one. It's a loop. And he doesn't just make vague claims. He points fingers. He's very specific about where he thinks this pressure is coming from. He argues that China, for instance, uses the history card as a way to gain geopolitical leverage in Asia today. He also looks at Western nations like France and basically calls out what he sees as hypocrisy, criticizing Japan while conveniently forgetting their own long histories of colonialism. And this quote from him really sums it all up. As long as America, Britain, France, the Netherlands, and Russia do not apologize, there is no reason for Japan to apologize first. Now, to be really clear here, he's not saying Japan is blameless. His point is that Japan's actions didn't happen in a vacuum. They happened in an age of global imperialism, and he argues that singling out Japan for a special kind of apology is a political move, not just a moral one. Okay, this next point is absolutely crucial to his whole argument. For decades, you've heard the comparison, right? Why can't Japan just be more like Germany? Well, Nishio completely and utterly rejects that comparison. And here's why. He breaks it down like this. In his view, what happened in Germany with the Nazis was a unique crime, an ideological war of extermination. It was a 12-year aberration, as he puts it, that post-war Germans could kind of wall off from the rest of their history and condemn. But he sees Japan's war very differently. For him, it was a complex conflict born out of a reaction to Western colonialism and encirclement. It was a war against Western imperialism in Asia. So in his mind, you're comparing apples and oranges. They're just fundamentally different kinds of conflicts. You can almost feel his frustration in this quote. The simple thing that should have been said was, Japan is not Nazi Germany. He basically argues that for decades, Japanese leaders just failed to make this very simple but incredibly important distinction. And because of that failure, this false comparison was allowed to grow, trapping Japan in a story, in a historical narrative that he believes was never really theirs to begin with. So from there, his argument gets even more detailed. He starts to reframe the Pacific War itself. And his core claim here is that Japan and the United States walked onto the battlefield playing two totally different games, with two completely different rulebooks. Okay, so on one hand, you've got what's called limited war. Think of this as the old school classical way of thinking about it. War is a tool of politics. It's brutal, yeah, but it's fought between armies for specific goals. You want this territory, you want those resources. It's not a moral crusade to prove that the other side is pure evil. Nishio argues that this was the only kind of war Japan was prepared to fight. But then, he says, America brought something new to the table: total war. And this was a whole different animal. It wasn't just armies fighting armies anymore. It was an absolute struggle between good and evil. Your entire country, your entire population is mobilized. And the goal isn't just to win, it's unconditional surrender. And if you lose, you're not just the defeated party, you're a criminal. So if you look at it from Nishio's perspective, the rules of the game were changed midstream. Japan enters the war thinking it's fighting a limited political war. The plan, as he sees it, was to score a few big wins, shock the Western powers, and then sit down at the negotiating table. They were, in his view, completely blindsided when the U.S. framed the conflict as this total ideological war, a fight to the death between good and evil, with no room for negotiation. Now, to back all this up, Nishio leans heavily on a really interesting source, an American historian named Helen Mears. She wrote a book back in 1948 called America's Mirror, Japan. And get this, it was so critical of American policy that the U.S. occupation authorities actually banned it in Japan. For Nishio, that's all the proof he needs. The fact that it was censored, to him, just makes its arguments more powerful. So what did Mears say that was so controversial? Well, she basically argued that Japan learned everything it knew about building an empire by watching the West. They were just imitating the great powers of the time, like Britain and America. So, she said, it was pretty hypocritical for the U.S. to then turn around and paint Japan as this uniquely evil, aggressive force. You can see why Nishio loves this, right? It's a validation for his entire thesis, and it's coming from an American historian. All right, so after laying out this whole, very detailed alternative view of history, what's the endgame? Where does Nishio want to go with this? Well, he wraps it all up with a call to action for Japan, a path forward that's all about finally listening to that silence. And he breaks it down into 4 steps. First, he says Japan needs to overcome this sickness of constant self-blame and apology. Second, reject these one-sided judgments from other countries. Third, start to assert its own story, a narrative that it was a nation fighting for its survival. And finally, listen to its own silent history to build a unified national will. It's a roadmap to move past what he calls the apology sickness. And really, this is the absolute crucial point of the whole book. Look, whether you agree with him or not, what Nishio is doing here is challenging the very idea that the winners get to write the history, period. He's making the case that the defeated, the ones who lost, also have a right to tell their own story, to interpret their own past from their own perspective. So yeah, this has been a deep dive into a really challenging and, for many, a very controversial perspective. And it all boils down to this one final massive question. After a war is over, who actually gets to write the history? Nishio's work forces us to see that history isn't just a list of things that happened. It's a story. And that story is shaped by power. Which leaves you wondering, is the final chapter of any history ever really written?